So today we begin this season of Advent, a tradition in the Christian church where we once again tell the story of Jesus, the narrative of his birth, and we reclaim again the story of liberation from oppression, and we reclaim again the story of hope for the world. It is appropriate that on this Sunday we light this first candle of hope as a reminder that the light still shines in the darkness. And that this light that is embodied not just on the Advent wreath is a light that is embodied in each and every one of us that is called to be hope-filled in a world that can often feel hopeless. Last Sunday I preached passionately, perhaps too passionately, about the state of the world and talked about how for many of us there is an overwhelming feeling of hopelessness. An overwhelming experience of the many tragedies and disasters and the ways in which the powers of this earth stand against the values of Jesus. And that how in so many ways those of us who are believers, those of us who are the faithful, sometimes find ourselves in that same despair, wondering what we can do, how we can affect some change on the world. How can we, like Jesus who came more than 2,000 years ago, make a difference? How can our lives carry that light into the world in this season of Advent, in this season of hope, in this season of peace and joy and love, peace and goodwill to all of God's people? How are we transformed by this gospel message one more time? In the same way that those early followers of Jesus would also be transformed, need to find transformation in order that their lives too would matter. Seems amazing that in our gospel reading this morning it appears, and perhaps if we have eyes to see and ears to hear, might believe that this particular text was written just for our generation. A generation when we too see signs in the skies, signs in the world, signs in our own lives that change is about to happen. I truly believe that this gospel message, this good news of Jesus, is one that should inspire us and encourage us, and that even in the times of hopelessness, we look forward to something that is to change. And today, as we open this season of Advent, we ask ourselves, where will we put our focus this Christmas? Where will we place our attention? I've come to the realization that if I place my attention only on those things that I cannot change, perhaps I'm wasting my time. That perhaps the gospel good news is a reflection of how our lives should matter, how our lives should be. And that we too, as people of faith in this season of our world, should be looking for signs beyond the national media. That we should be looking for signs beyond the popular culture, that we should be looking at signs beyond the disasters of the world, and perhaps call our attention to some of the places where hope exists. Perhaps it would behoove us in this season of Advent to think again about where we spend our time and how we might affect some change just in the lives that surround us. That's not to say that we should not pay attention to what's happening in the world, but how do we make a change in the world as we know it? How can we be the light of the world? How can we be those beacons of hope in the world? And how can we take the light of the candles that we will light over these next 4 weeks and make full on the promise of Jesus? A promise of Jesus that says the earth and the heaven will fade away, but my word, my hope will never fade away if we can keep hope alive in our lives. I'm spending too much time on Facebook. I'm spending too much time observing all of the disasters of the world. I'm spending too much time in moments of doom and gloom. And perhaps failing to see the hope that continues to spring eternal in the lives of those that I get to witness 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. I see a lot of hope at Cathedral of Hope this morning as we gather for our worship experience. I see a people who are committed to changing the world. I see a commitment of a people who are willing to stand against injustice and against the systems of oppression. But I also see a people who are willing to step beyond themselves and to continue to transform the lives of those who are around them. I continue to see that light, that beacon of hope that springs eternal in the ways in which we respond to the many needs of our world. But I also see those lights of eternal hope in the ways in which we are beginning to treat one another, in the ways that we have come together and bound ourselves together in what could be a time of hopelessness and depression. I see ourselves looking to one another to light the candles of hope in our hearts, and to remind us that for some of us, we have been through much, much worse than what the world might be able to throw at us. That we are a resilient people, perhaps even a resistant people. But we are a people who stand on something that is bigger than the world, and that is Jesus the Christ, who came to earth to demonstrate the power of God's love and the power of a transforming spirit from which we have our heritage. Yesterday was World AIDS Day. And we gathered in this sanctuary to remember the hundreds and thousands of lives that were lost during the AIDS pandemic. AIDS is still with us, siblings in Christ. But we gathered to remember and to recommit ourselves to bringing AIDS to an end by 2030. You might think that that is an undoable thing, but last evening we learned how it can be doable if we would but be the light of hope in the world. We also shared a poem last evening. It was written in 2001 by the Reverend Jim Matulski, who was the interim minister here between the departure of the former senior pastor and the arrival of this new senior pastor. And Jim wrote this poem in 2001 as a man living with AIDS. At that point, he was dying of AIDS. He had been in hospital many, many times in those years, and there were many, many diagnoses that in those days believed that he would never come out of that hospital. And 17 years later, he did. He is. And still living an experience of the miracle of transformation, that the power of God in his life, when he pays attention to hope, can make a difference. In this poem, he said, "I wish and I pray that I might live to a time when I see an end of AIDS." In 2001, that was not possible. And in 2018, his body stands as a beacon of the power of hope that exists in the world. Hope exists when we make it real. It's not just the story of a Jesus who was born in a manger 2,000 years ago. It's the story of a cosmic Christ that is still present today when we consent to embody that hope in us. It is the cosmic Christ, the universal Christ, the blessedness of that Christ that stands with us this day and says, "People, you are a people of hope. You know the miracle of God's love. Now live it in the world, and do not allow the world to distract you by believing there is hopelessness when you know the power of hope in the world." It is that we celebrate on this first Sunday in Advent. A hope that does not overcome us unless we allow it to. It is a hope that transforms us. Jesus said the generations will not fade away before hope makes its home in you and me. Hopelessness only overtakes when we pay attention too much to the ways of the world and neglect the ways of God. A God who has proven God's power over many tragedies, over many moments of despair in our lives. And yet we are still here, siblings in Christ. It is that hope that I want to hold on to. It is that hope that reminds me that we can still make a difference. It is that hope that reminds me that when we extinguish the candle on the Advent wreath because we don't want the sprinklers to go off, that when we extinguish that candle, it is lit again in your heart. It is lit again when you visit the giving tree and you take something off of that as a gift to someone that you might never know. It is lit in you when you reach out to a neighbor who is in need or you have not seen on your pew for the last few weeks, and you reach out and you ask, "How are you? I've missed you." It is hope that continues to be alive when we consent to allow that hope to be present in our neighbor as well as in ourselves, and illuminates a pathway for someone who is perhaps hopeless in this season of their life. And it is that hope that stays alive when we too have found ourselves estranged from community, and someone reaches out to us and says, "May I help? Can I assist?" For it is that cosmic Christ that is made real in you, the hands, the feet, the embodiment of Christ, that can only show up when hope exists. There is this good news of a cosmic Christ that says, do not be overshadowed by the ways of the world, but be shadowed only by the grace of God that reminds you are the light of the world. And in that light, darkness cannot prevail. No matter how much that darkness might be, you light one candle and it illuminates the path. And it shows up again and again. That's what Jesus meant when he said, "I'm the way, the truth, and the life." I light the pathway so that you might follow. And how much more exciting it would be if we could not see left and right, but could only see the pathway. Jesus today is with us. Not just a child in the manger, but Jesus is with us in you. And we must never allow the world to take that from us. It is the hope that keeps life alive. What can we do? We can't necessarily change the systems of the world overnight. But we can change our world overnight. We can change that little bit of our world that can be transformed by the power of the light of Christ today. And who knows? If we were to change that little bit of our world and affect the life of the person who's next to us, and they change their little bit of the world, and they change their little bit of the world, suddenly we're all having a Merry Christmas. And the new year, a new world, the miracle comes down at Christmas. I encourage us in these 4 weeks to have a moment where we may be the hope that the world is looking for. For let hope come to earth, but let it begin with me. Let it begin with you. And I truly, truly believe God will show up again and again, not just in the manger, but in the manger of our lives. Let us be hope-filled in an often hopeless world. For we are the change that will happen at Christmas. Just wait. God bless you. Cathedral of Hope, United Church of Christ.